My boss demanded I follow his ridiculous, outdated process, even after I warned him it would end in disaster. So I did exactly what he asked, every single step. 3 weeks later, he was escorted out of the building by security, and I got his office. This is the story of how following orders became the sweetest revenge I've ever tasted. Before I dive into this absolute train wreck of a story, do me a quick favor. Hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And drop a comment telling me, have you ever had a boss so stubborn they couldn't see their own failure coming? I want to hear your stories. Now, let me tell you what happened. I've been working at Meridian Document Solutions for almost 4 years when this whole nightmare began. We weren't a huge company, maybe 200 employees total, but we handled document processing and printing for some major corporate clients. Banks, law firms, insurance companies, the kind of clients who needed thousands of pages printed, sorted, and shipped on tight deadlines. I started in the mailroom, honestly, but I worked my way up to production coordinator within 2 years. I was proud of that. I knew our systems inside and out. I knew which machines jammed when humidity was high. I knew which paper stock worked best for double-sided legal documents. I knew this job better than I knew my own apartment. And then Gerald Hoffman arrived. Gerald was hired as our new production manager after our previous manager, Linda, retired. Linda had been wonderful, collaborative, open to suggestions, always willing to adapt when something wasn't working. Gerald was the opposite in every conceivable way. He was in his mid-50s, always wearing the same rotation of 3 ill-fitting suits, and he had this habit of adjusting his glasses while looking down at you, even if you were taller than him. He came from some old-school printing company that had gone under years ago, and he acted like that failure somehow made him an expert. From day one, Gerald made it clear that he didn't value input from anyone below him. In his first week, he called a department meeting and announced that we'd been doing things wrong, that our processes were inefficient, and that he was going to fix everything. I remember sitting in that meeting, looking around at my coworkers, people who had been doing this job successfully for years, watching their faces fall as Gerald essentially told us we were all incompetent. The first major change Gerald implemented was what he called the Sequential Batch Protocol. Now, let me explain why this was absolutely insane. Under Linda, we used parallel processing. If we had a job requiring 10,000 documents, we'd split it across multiple machines, multiple operators, running simultaneously. It was efficient, it was fast, it met our deadlines with room to spare. Gerald's sequential batch protocol meant everything had to go through one designated primary machine first, then get quality checked, then move to the next stage, one piece at a time. He claimed this reduced errors and improved quality control. What it actually did was triple our processing time. I tried to explain this to him. I really did. I walked into his office about 2 weeks after he implemented the new system. I had data. I had charts. I had a comparison showing our turnaround times before and after his changes. Gerald, I said, keeping my voice professional, I've noticed our completion rates have dropped significantly since we switched to the new protocol. I've put together some numbers that might help us find a middle ground. He didn't even look at the folder I placed on his desk. He just leaned back in his chair, adjusted those stupid glasses, and smiled at me like I was a child who just asked why the sky was blue. Sarah, he said, he always dragged out my name like that, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I've been doing this for 30 years. The sequential batch protocol is industry standard. The problems you're seeing are just growing pains. Trust the process.
Trust the process. I heard that phrase so many times over the following weeks that it started appearing in my stress dreams. But here's where it gets really bad. We had a massive contract with Harrison Legal Group, one of the biggest law firms in the state. They needed 45,000 pages of case documents printed, collated, and delivered for a major trial. The deadline was absolutely firm. Miss it, and they'd not only cancel our contract, but probably sue us for damages. I sat down with my team and calculated the timeline. Using Gerald's sequential batch protocol, there was no mathematical way we could complete this job on time. We'd miss the deadline by at least 3 days, probably more. So I went to Gerald again. This time, I brought my supervisor, Marcus, with me for backup. We explained the situation calmly, professionally, with all the data laid out. Gerald, Marcus said, "We're not trying to undermine your system. We're trying to save this contract. If we could just run parallel processing for this one job." Gerald held up his hand, cutting Marcus off mid-sentence. "No exceptions," he said, his voice cold. "If I make an exception for you, everyone will want exceptions. The protocol exists for a reason. Follow it." I took a deep breath. "Gerald, if we follow the protocol, we will miss this deadline. That's not an opinion, that's math." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he said something I'll never forget. "Sarah, are you refusing to follow my direct instructions? Because if you are, I can find someone who will." And there it was, the threat. Follow orders or lose your job. I looked at Marcus, he looked at me. We both understood what was happening. Gerald wasn't interested in being right, he was interested in being obeyed. So I made a decision. If Gerald wanted his precious protocol followed to the letter, then that's exactly what he would get. "Understood," I said quietly. "We'll follow the protocol." What followed was 3 weeks of meticulously documented compliance. I created detailed logs of every single step we took, timestamps for when documents entered each phase, records of every delay caused by the sequential processing requirement. I CC'd Gerald on every status update email, making sure he acknowledged receipt. I was polite, I was professional, I was thorough. And I was building a case. My team understood what we were doing. Nobody said it out loud, but there was this unspoken agreement in the production room. We would follow Gerald's rules perfectly, and we would let those rules destroy him. It was hard, honestly. There were moments when I wanted to just ignore his stupid protocol and do things the right way. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to fix the problem before it became a catastrophe. But I knew that if I did that, if I saved the day despite Gerald's incompetence, nothing would ever change. He'd take credit for the success and keep implementing terrible policies. Sometimes you have to let the ship sink to prove the captain is steering it into rocks. The deadline arrived on a Tuesday. We had completed approximately 60% of the Harrison legal job. 60%. 27,000 pages out of 45,000. The law firm called at 8 in the morning. Then they called again at 9. By 10, their office manager was on the phone with our CEO, absolutely screaming. I was at my workstation when I heard Gerald get called into the CEO's office. The walls weren't thick enough to block out the shouting. I could hear words like liability, breach of contract, and my personal favorite, "What were you thinking?" About an hour later, Gerald stormed into the production room looking for someone to blame. His face was red, his tie was loosened, and he was sweating through his dress shirt. "Who's responsible for this?" he shouted, waving a printout of the project timeline. "Who dropped the ball?" I stood up slowly from my desk. "Nobody dropped the ball, Gerald," I said, my voice steady. "We followed your sequential batch protocol exactly as instructed. Would you like to see the documentation?" I pulled out the folder I'd been building for 3 weeks. Every email where he'd refused to authorize parallel processing. Every log showing exactly how his protocol created the delays. Every message where I'd warned him about the timeline and he'd dismissed my concerns. Gerald's face went from red to white in about 3 seconds. You did this on purpose," he stammered. "I did exactly what you told me to do," I replied. "I trusted the process, just like you said." The CEO was standing in the doorway. I hadn't even noticed her arrive. She'd heard everything. "Gerald," she said, her voice ice cold. "My office, now." He turned and walked past her like a man heading to his own execution. In a way, he was. The fallout was significant. Harrison Legal didn't sue us. Our CEO personally flew to their offices with a formal apology and a heavily discounted contract for future work. It cost the company tens of thousands of dollars to make it right. Gerald was terminated that Friday. I watched security escort him out with a banker's box of his personal belongings. He didn't look at anyone as he left. He just stared straight ahead, that stunned expression still frozen on his face. 2 weeks later, I was promoted to production manager, his job. I moved into his office, sat in his chair, and immediately sent out a company-wide email announcing the return of parallel processing. The team celebrated. Actually celebrated. Someone brought in a cake that said "Trust the process" with a big red X through it. We laughed about it for weeks. Looking back, I know some people might say I should have fought harder to prevent the disaster, that maybe I had a responsibility to go over Gerald's head before things got bad, and maybe they're right. Maybe in a perfect world, that's what I would have done, but this wasn't a perfect world. This was a world where a stubborn, arrogant man threatened my job for trying to tell him the truth. A world where my expertise was dismissed because it came from someone younger, someone female, someone with 30 years of experience at a company that failed. Gerald didn't want to listen. He wanted to command. So I let him command us right off a cliff. The lesson I took from all of this isn't that revenge is sweet, although honestly, it kind of was. The real lesson is that sometimes the best way to expose bad leadership is to follow it perfectly. Document everything, cover yourself, and when the house of cards collapses, make sure everyone knows exactly who built it. I still work at Meridian. My team is thriving. We haven't missed a deadline in over a year, and every time a new manager comes in with wild ideas about changing our